I'd like to remind members to send their speaking notes by email to the Hansard recorder and to switch electronic devices to silent. Beverages are not allowed. Can I ask people to speak clearly and precisely for the benefit of other colleagues and also the Hansard recorder, and to give an early indication if they wish to speak would be much appreciated. We now come to Group 10 and Amendment 3 to Clause 15, with which it will be convenient to consider Clauses 15 and 16 and new Clauses 6 and 7. Does anybody wish to move Amendment 3?
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Job.
Thank you, Chair. On Thursday's evidence session, I asked the Minister why pupil data was not within the orbit and remit of this bill. And he said on the question of, as I quote, on the question of schools, more broadly the question of public sector authorities, I entirely accept that the handling of pupil data in schools is a critical aspect of our public service operations. The reason why public service authorities have largely been left out of the bill's scope is because we do not need to wait for the legislative process to act. We have been working, not least closely, with the government's cyber security strategy and the cyber action plan to ensure that pupil data is kept securely and robustly, unquote. Since he said that in this place on Thursday last week, I have been researching any action taken in respect of the government's cyber security strategy and the cyber action plan, and can find no record of them dealing with the issue of pupil data. And so I wonder if this morning the Minister could specify what he meant when he said that last Thursday, or commit to coming back to the committee with that detail.
I'm sure the Minister will have heard what the Honourable Member has said and may wish to reflect, but it's not really a matter for the Chair, nevertheless it's on the record.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Draft.
Thank you, Chair. Yesterday I was speaking in a petition debate in Westminster Hall on, it was a petition signed by 114,000 members of the public calling for a public inquiry into Russian influence in British democracy. And in doing my research for the response I was making on behalf of His Majesty's opposition, I came upon the government's statement in respect of this bill, which says, introducing the Cyber Security and Resilience (brackets Network and Information Systems) (brackets) bill in November 2025, which would require organisations in critical sectors to further protect their IT systems, unquote. The split infinitive notwithstanding, I do not believe that this bill requires any organisations in critical sectors to further protect their IT systems. And if the Minister thinks that the government is correct in saying that, would he like to direct us in the bill where that requirement is laid down by this bill?
I thank him for his point of order. Once again, if the Minister wishes to respond when he comes to make his remarks, he's open to do so. And of course, the Honourable Member, who's very adept at these things, will be able to weave any further comments he may have into his contributions during our proceedings. I'm now going to move, ask if there's a member that wishes to move Amendment 3. And I'm thinking not. Thank you very much. So we're now going to come to the question that Clause 15 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Clause 16 and new Clauses 6 and 7. The question is that Clause 15 stand part of the bill, and I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I will begin by discussing Clauses 15 and 16. Clause 15 updates the incident reporting provisions in the NIS regulations. Under the current regulations, organisations are only required to report incidents once they've had a significant impact on service continuity. This is widely recognised as too narrow and results in a range of concerning incidents going unreported and a distorted picture of how secure and resilient the UK's essential services actually are. To take two examples, a ransomware attack where confidential data has been exfiltrated from an organisation without an immediate impact on service would not be reportable. Nor would a pre-positioning attack, where a hostile actor has hacked into a network and is in a position to cause significant disruption down the line, such as to the provision of drinking water. This cannot be right, and does not reflect the cyber threats that critical services face. To ensure such incidents are caught, this clause sets a new, wider definition of incidents that must be reported. The focus is now on incidents that have successfully affected the security or operation of an organisation's network and are likely to have a significant UK impact. This will ensure that regulators and the NCSE are fully aware of the range of cyber threats affecting the UK's essential services. The bill sets out the factors that should be considered when assessing whether an impact has had or is likely to have a significant impact in the UK, including, crucially, whether the confidentiality, authenticity, integrity and availability of data has been compromised. The Government will provide further clarity in secondary legislation, setting out thresholds for each sector for when an incident is considered to have had or to be likely to have a significant impact. This will be consulted on before it is introduced. Together, this means only meaningful incidents are reported. I know over-reporting has been a concern raised by honourable members in the progress of this bill, and I would like to stress this point. Things like unsuccessful phishing emails will clearly not be reportable, as they will not be likely to have a significant impact. Given our economy's systemic dependence on data centre facilities, for that sector alone, we will also ensure that Ofcom and the NCSE receive reports on a wider range of potential incidents and near misses. This ensures that not only immediate disruptions, but also incidents posing future risks are reported. The clause also streamlines the reporting processes for all NIS sectors. This ensures that incident notifications and reports go to the NCSE at the same time as the regulator. It also sets out what those organisations can do with the information that they receive, including how the information can be shared to manage the wider impacts of an incident or prevent future incidents. Finally, the clause introduces faster reporting so that the NCSE and regulators are informed within 24 hours of entities becoming aware that a reportable incident is taking place. The 24-hour notification will be light touch, but it will be crucial in enabling the NCSE and regulators to offer faster support to minimise the negative impacts of incidents. Fuller details will need to be reported within 72 hours of the entity becoming aware that a reportable incident is happening. These changes will protect the UK's essential services, ensuring that the NCSE and regulators are able to provide the best support they can. Clause 16 sets out requirements for managed service providers, relevant digital service providers and operators of data centres to inform customers who are likely to have been adversely affected by a reportable incident. Under the current regulations, there is no requirement for any regulated entity to inform its customers if it has been impacted by a reportable incident. This may have made sense when the NIS regulations were more heavily focused on operators of essential services and the primary concern was service disruption. But it would be an inexcusable omission now that the bill is expanding to include managed service providers and operators of data centres in addition to the digital service providers already in scope. These are organisations that, if compromised, could leave their customers' systems, data or services exposed or inaccessible, and in such circumstances, it is vital that their customers are notified so they can take whatever steps they need to mitigate those risks. I'm happy to give way.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. 2 points, if I may, for the Minister to address. First one being, could he clarify if an organisation would face repercussions if a regulator believed in retrospect that notification should have been provided sooner? And with regard to customer notification, can the Minister address concern around striking the right balance between informing the customer and ensuring that the update that they receive is meaningful and not so sufficiently vague that it causes further distress or worry for the customer on the receiving end of that notification? Minister?
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for two very thoughtful points. On the first, in terms of regulatory action retrospectively about the adequacy of notification, I expect the regulators will set out in both their guidance and in working closely with each of the entities in scope the expectations they will have about the nature of the notification, the timeliness of the notification. That will, of course, be one input into regulators' broader assessment of the entity's compliance with the regime in question. So I would expect that the timely notification will be an element that will be assessed on an ongoing basis by the regulator, but I wouldn't expect it to be an exclusive or primary aspect of it. On the second particular question of customer notifications being proportionate, I totally share his concern about both ensuring that it is timely, it is efficient, but at the same time that is meaningful for relevant customers. And I would hope exactly that those principles are embodied in the guidance that regulators share about notification requirements. In such circumstances, Chair, it is vital that customers are notified so they can take whatever steps to mitigate those risks. This is all the more important given that in many cases, those customers will themselves be operators of essential services and other critical national infrastructure. The bill therefore places new transparency requirements on managed service providers, relevant digital service providers, and operators of data centres. Similar requirements were introduced under the NIS2 regulations in the European Union. Clause 16 requires those regulated entities to take steps to establish which of their customers, if any, are likely to be adversely affected by a reported incident. It then sets out the information that the entity must share with those identified customers. These new requirements will support the overall resilience of the UK's essential services and economy, which depends so heavily on these services, and reduce the overall impact of disruptive cyber attacks.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. These two new clauses sit together and are linked by the same practical concern, clarity and workability when an incident is unfolding. I'll start with new clause 6. Ransomware is no longer an occasional or unusual cyber event. It's now one of the most common and disruptive threats facing essential services, digital providers and their supply chains. Written evidence to this committee was clear that ransomware incidents are now routine, high-impact events, and that uncertainty at the outset of an attack often makes the consequences worse. The bill quite rightly broadens the definition of an incident to capture events that are capable of causing harm, not just those that already have. That is the right direction of travel. But when organisations are under pressure, particularly in the first 24 hours of an incident, uncertainty slows action. Time is lost debating definitions rather than focusing on containment, escalation and reporting. New Clause 6 addresses that problem directly. It makes explicit that a ransomware attack is an incident for the purposes of the NIS regulations, and it sets out clearly what is meant by a ransomware attack. This doesn't create a new duty, it removes doubt from an existing one. Clear definitions support better behaviour when organisations are operating under real pressure. New Clause 7 follows on naturally from that point. If we want faster and clearer reporting, the system organisations are reporting into has to work in practice, not just on paper. This bill expands reporting requirements and introduces new notification duties. This is understandable. But UK Finance told the committee that many firms already support cyber incidents under multiple regulatory regimes and that additional reporting layers risk duplication rather than resilience. When an incident is live, that duplication causes friction. It slows response, it increases cost. And it can reduce the quality of information being shared because teams are stretched across parallel processes rather than focused on managing the incident itself. New Clause 7 does not seek to reopen the policy intent of the bill. It asks for a review, once these changes are in force, of how the reporting requirements are working in practice. It asks that review to consider cost and interaction with other reporting frameworks. And it asks for proposals for a single cyber incident reporting channel. That is not a bureaucratic exercise. It reflects concerns raised in evidence that resilience is undermined, not strengthened, when reporting becomes fragmented at moments of stress. Taken together, New Clause 6 and 7 are about making the system clearer at the front end and more usable overall. Clear definitions encourage timely reporting. Coherent reporting channels make that reporting effective. And I hope the committee will now give serious consideration to both new clauses.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Dr. Morrison, and always a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton. I will speak to clauses 15 and 16 and beg to move the new clauses tabled in my name on behalf of His Majesty's Loyal Opposition, new clause 6 and new clause 7. The previous government stated in its consultation covering the subject of cyber incident reporting that security breaches that did not result in a successful attack could still leave organisations open to follow-up attacks. It was identified that reporting how the breach took place would also allow regulators and other organisations to prepare for similar attacks in the future. It's therefore a welcome development that Clause 15 significantly increases the scope and speed of cyber incident reporting by regulated entities to competent authorities and the NCSC. In terms of scope, this is achieved by broadening the definition of reportable incidents from the current position where only cyber attacks having an actual adverse effect are reportable, to a position where cyber incidents which are capable of having an adverse effect on the operation or security of networks and information systems must also be reported. The government's explanatory notes for the bill state that this change in definition is designed to include incidents that have compromised the integrity or security of a system without yet having caused significant disruption, but are capable of doing so in the future. This has been broadly welcomed by industry stakeholders as a measure that should provide regulators with better intelligence about emerging threats, leading to improved risk management and hardened resilience in their sectors. On the importance of intelligence gathering, we heard evidence from David Cook of DLO Piper and Chun-Ching Huang of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, amongst others, about the increasing use of pre-positioning and live-off-the-land technologies deployed by malicious actors. Once systems are infiltrated, attackers remain in systems, sometimes harvesting data and waiting for the moment when they can cause maximum harm and disruption. These serious risks should be flagged to regulators wherever they are identified. Dr. Sanjana Mehta of ISC2 described problems of underreporting in relation to the existing NIS regulations regime and welcomed the principle of expanding reporting, as did Jill Broom of Tech UK. However, both cautioned that while some high-level factors have been provided as to the criteria indicating whether an attack should be reported, such as number of users impact, duration of interruption and geographical reach, what is not clear at present is the thresholds which are linked to those criteria. And these details are vital if reporting is to be successful in ensuring regulators are kept appraised of the most serious threats. Dr. Mehta summarised his concerns succinctly in her comment that, and I quote, "In the absence of those thresholds, the concern, ICS's concern, is that regulated entities may be tempted to over-report rather than under-report, thereby creating more demand on the efforts of the regulators." Likewise, Tech UK has stated in its written briefings on the bill that technically any phishing email is capable of having a significant impact if the organisation lacks adequate detection or response capabilities. This will lead to over-reporting of low-level incidents and potentially overwhelm regulators, thereby distracting attention from genuinely significant threats. So like many aspects of this bill, the problem is not in the principle, but in the detail. We heard in oral evidence about the concerns of industry and regulators regarding the availability of suitably qualified personnel to build capacity for effective regulatory oversight. We must be alive to this important consideration in ensuring thresholds are proportionate and risk-based. The government has stated in its fact sheets on the bill that it intends to introduce thresholds through secondary legislation after a period of consultation before this measure is brought into force. It's also said that these thresholds will clarify the points at which the impact of an incident could be significant and therefore reportable to regulators. So I asked the Minister, what discussions has he had to date with regulated entities and regulators about the approach to consultation on these thresholds? What is the feedback on what those organisations consider to be reporting priorities? Clause 15 also introduces comprehensive, updated procedures for reporting cybersecurity incidents. The timetables for reporting are shortened from existing ones, requiring regulated entities to make an initial report within 24 hours of discovering an incident and a more comprehensive report within 72 hours. In each case, both the relevant competent authority and the NCSC must receive those notifications. The initial report must include the entity's name, the essential service affected, and brief details of the incident. Full notifications must set out more in-depth information, including timing, duration, and whether the incident is ongoing, information regarding the impact of the incident or the impact which is likely to occur, and whether the incident was caused by a separate incident affecting another regulated entity. The NCSC is given enhanced information sharing powers in relation to operators of essential services, OESs, and data centres under Clause 15, which enable it to inform authorities in other jurisdictions when incident could have a significant impact on the security of network and information systems in those countries. Given the intensifying nature of cross-border enterprise and supply chains, including in the provision of digital services such as cloud services and data centre capacity, such information sharing is a desirable and increasingly necessary measure. In the traditional national security domain, cross-border intelligence sharing, subject to appropriate safeguards, is already vital to protecting our daily freedoms and the functioning of society. It's only right that this cooperation should be extended, again subject to appropriate safeguards, to the cybersecurity domain, given the broad acknowledgement that cybersecurity is vital and a growing element of our national security. The NCSC has also been granted powers, subject to consultation with the regulators and the reporting entity, to share information about cyber incidents to manage or prevent further risks, or where the NCSC believes disclosure of this information would be in the public interest. Given the widespread knock-on effects of attacks such as data breaches on individuals, this provision is clearly a necessary and useful power. This consideration is reflected in Clause 16, which obliges regulated entities to make their customers aware of incidents where their data has been compromised. Now, notwithstanding the necessity of these clauses, some industry stakeholders have expressed concerns about the extent of regulator information sharing powers under this bill more generally. Could the Minister provide reassurance beyond the thin information on the face of this bill regarding the safeguards that will be in place to prevent the sharing of sensitive information that could impact the businesses of those regulated entities? Now I come to new clause 6. Mr. Chair, the government has acknowledged through its recent consultations the particular risk presented by ransomware attacks to the UK economy. However, it has not yet brought forward formal legislative proposals for a broader reporting scheme. In the last year, ransomware was deployed in some of the cybersecurity attacks that have raised public awareness of cybersecurity and caused the greatest disruption to jobs, supply chains and the economy. We've heard in oral evidence from Detective Chief Superintendent Andrew Gould that critical national infrastructure is less likely to be attacked by ransomware groups, but beyond these entities, ransomware is one of the principal security threats to businesses. For so many SMEs and small organisations, these attacks have the potential to be fatal to business models. The widespread and highly damaging nature of ransomware attacks mean that regulators need to have detailed oversight of these risks, often perpetrated by criminal groups at scale and speed, to prevent them being deployed more widely. I'm more than happy to give way to the member opposite from Harlow.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way and for remembering my constituency. I haven't mentioned Harlow, no. Can I ask the Shadow Minister how this amendment is helpful, given the confusion it potentially causes, listing a specific kind of incident as well as the generic one?
Well, I thank him for intervention. The very point is that we are, as an opposition, trying to make clear that ransomware needs to be within the scope of reporting. I think it's really for the Minister to answer if he thinks that there's problems with this amendment, and if so, how the government's actually going to go about taking it forwards. The widespread and highly damaging nature of ransomware attacks mean that regulators need to have detailed oversights of these areas to prevent them being deployed more widely. Therefore, this amendment is intended to ensure that all ransomware attacks on regulated entities are reported, regardless of severity or potential severity, so that these risks are picked up. Now, I'm acutely aware, in tabling this amendment, of the existing reporting burden for regulated entities and regulated. And since tabling, we've also had impactful evidence from Carla Baker from Palo Alto, who highlighted a number of cyber incidents and false positives many companies encounter each day. But as I said in response to the intervention, in the absence of measures brought forward by government to address these widespread and urgent risks presented by ransomware attacks, it has itself identified as part of the Home Office's review, I would argue that it would be proportionate to make specific reference to ransomware in the reporting requirements on regulated entities under this bill. Moving on to new clause 7, this reflects the concerns of regulated bodies and industry representatives set out many times in all evidence and beyond regarding the need to ensure that reporting obligations are clear and, as far as possible, simplified across the many different incident reporting regimes that exist for providers of digital services. This new clause would compel the Secretary of State, within 12 months of royal assent, to publish an assessment of the impact on regulated entities of the new reporting regime under this bill. Importantly, and in line with the clear request articulated by so many stakeholders who gave evidence last Tuesday, it requires the government to publish proposals for the creation of a single cyber incident reporting channel for relevant bodies. More than happy to give way to the member opposite.
Thank you, Chair. I work for the AI and Digital Regulatory Service with the NHS, so we're linking with all of the regulators to try and have this one-stop, one-shop door approach to how we do things. It's incredibly difficult, and 3 years on, we were still ironing out all the glitches. So it's a laudable new clause, but I would say a 12-month proposal, I'd say that's a very tight time frame to try and get this right, because I know how difficult it is.
Well, I thank her for her intervention. This is an assessment of the impact which is being put forward, so it's not to make definitive changes. This will give time. I mean, I've got confidence in the government and minister that within 12 months, it's the kiss of death saying you have confidence at the moment, isn't it?
Thank you.
I apologise to the minister.
It wasn't a criticism of the government. I just know how hard it is for regulators to work together and iron out how all the cross-working is. They were very confident in their information sharing skills, but it's more difficult than it is. So it's just a kind assurance that this is not an easy solution, and 12 months is a bit of a tight time frame.
Thank you. I very much take a point, and also the constructive spirit in which it was presented. 12 months is a long time for the operations of governments to operate. And so I do have faith, I'll change my words, in terms of the government and its all its powers, if it wanted to put its mind to it, to bring this forwards. It's worth reflecting if there are concerns about the ability of the DSIT to take this forwards. Those concerns would spill over more broadly in all the consultation requirements that have to be done to make sure that this bill functions in the correct way. So I think this argument could swing both ways in terms of what we're debating here today. Industry stakeholders have expressed strong concern regarding the diverse incident reporting requirements that exist in several pieces of legislation, including UK GDPR, sector-specific regulation, and the Telecommunications Security Act 2021. As we've already discussed today, the Home Office may also bring forward guidelines for reporting of ransomware incidents in the future. This additional reporting requirements and procedures included in the bill are viewed as adding a further layer of complexity to a legislative environment that's already very challenging to navigate. Stakeholders report that the current approach of multiple different reporting procedures and platforms increases regulatory compliance costs in businesses and detracts from the resources available to implement effective improvements in cyber resilience. In view of this, will the Minister support this urgently needed review clause to assure industries that the government's heard their serious and vital concerns on this matter? Thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. When introducing new legislation, it's essential that those who will fall under its new regulations be clearly identified and given adequate time to prepare for compliance. However, despite the aims of the bill and the wish to avoid worsening a cyber attack incident, this bill still presents far too much ambiguity. It is right to recognise the cyber landscape as continuously evolving. There is no dispute that this terrain becomes increasingly complex each day, therefore requiring a level of flexibility in legislation to ensure that it keeps pace. However, this desire to safeguard such adaptability and goal of future-proofing must not come at the expense of the effectiveness of legislation in the present day. The powers afforded to the Secretary of State to change the classification of essential activity to bring new sectors into scope of this bill at any time undoubtedly creates uncertainty for many sectors and casts a shadow on long-term compliance. To be clear, we want organisations to comply with this legislation. We want to improve national cyber resilience, gather vital intelligence and restore public confidence in our security. So why then would there not be a significant effort to make these regulations as easy to apply as possible, rather than leaving thousands of businesses second-guessing whether they fall under the scope, with the pressure of large financial penalties hanging over their heads? In addition, many will know that I'm a firm supporter of parliamentary process. I support the notion that all legislation should receive the scrutiny it is due by the democratically elected members of the House of Commons. That is why I believe this bill must not only set out clearer guidelines for who is in scope, but also require an official amendment debated in the House to permanently bring any new sectors into scope after the bill has been passed. And I understand that in times of emergency, the longer process of House of Commons scrutiny may not always be possible, and that's why the Secretary of State should have powers to bring in sectors necessary to that emergency into scope on a temporary basis, with less imposing non-compliance penalties until made permanent by the House. This approach would not only allow for the desired quick reactions that cybersecurity demands, but would also respect the process of this place and safeguard against organisations being unaware that they've suddenly been brought into scope until they receive a potentially financially ruinous penalty notice for non-compliance. And looking at the need for more definitive guidelines for who will be regulated under this bill, we've already heard from numerous industry stakeholders that are unsure if they or other organisations in their sector will fall under the mandatory scope. In addition, industry experts have publicly shared concern about how far the net may be cast in some sectors, leading to the unintentional inclusions of organisations that are only critical to a larger single organisation as opposed to our national security, whilst ignoring other essential sectors altogether. Looking at recent cyber attacks that have had a significant impact on our country, it's concerning that the definition of essential services may not include them in scope. Whilst it's predicted that many of their supply chains will be in scope, it's been publicly questioned whether Jaguar Land Rover themselves will be included. As the largest car manufacturer in the United Kingdom, they directly employ over 30,000 people across the UK and support 100,000 jobs. Sorry, Chair, lost my notes. 100,000 jobs indirectly. It's therefore no surprise that the cyber attack they endured, estimated to have a financial impact of over £1 billion, was significant to many, including the over 5,000 organisations impacted and numerous of my constituents, with JLR being one of the largest direct and indirect employers within the West Midlands region. How then, if a key aim of the bill is to ensure all essential services who would profoundly impact our nation in the event of a cyber attack, reports or major incidents, could the vagueness of the essential services definition be allowed to stand, especially when it creates a situation where previous key victims are excluded? Of course, JLR is not the only victim where questions of inclusion remain. Also potentially falling outside of regulatory reach is Marks & Spencer, whose recent attack stood as another stark reminder of the rapidly advancing cybercrime scene and caused significant disruption, with costs estimated to run into the millions of pounds. Having met with M&S representatives recently, I had the opportunity to discuss the experience of enduring such a significant attack. And Archie Norman, the M&S chair, gave evidence to the Business and Trade Subcommittee on Economic Security, where he said, a growth economy is a cyber-resilient economy. Having a cyber-resilient UK and making the UK the safest place to do business is a competitive advantage. Now, I agree with that sentiment and firmly believe that increasing our cyber resilience can only benefit our economy. It's imperative that we get this right. These cyber threats are not going away. They're only going to get stronger. They'll only become more technically advanced, as we've seen in the past year, with the National Cybersecurity Centre reporting a 50% increase in British cyber incidents deemed highly significant. Indeed, representatives of M&S told me that at times they found it much easier to get updates and information from the US FBI than they did from our own authorities. And we know that foreign hostile states are becoming bolder in their acts against us. I stated a few months ago, as a reason for my 10-minute rule bill, research revealed that 74% of UK IT leaders cite China, 71% cite Russia as their top cybersecurity concern, and it's undisputable that last year's espionage trials threw a harsh spotlight on the threatening scale of state-sponsored cyber attacks. So improving all of our national cyber resilience and safeguarding all of our infrastructure and essential services, including in the private sector, is vital to secure a prosperous economy and reinforce public confidence in our ability to defend ourselves against such threats.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a few questions for the Minister, and I really appreciate the clarity that comes to many of those services within this. I wanted to understand how the incidents definition would relate to hardware vulnerabilities that are discovered within a company, like we heard from some of the people giving evidence earlier. For me, this is unclear within the bill, and maybe it's because it will be further defined in secondary legislation. So I want to understand how an incident where you discover a vulnerability within hardware like a SIP is then reported through, and then how that information is then delivered back by the regulator to other companies within the sector that may have similar technology, and to the other regulators that may also want to flag that technology as a particular vulnerability. Is that defined as an incident, or is that defined somewhere else within the bill? I'm just a bit confused and looking for some clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and having been promoted from a position of mere confidence to faith, I will tackle the Shadow Minister's particular questions first and foremost. On the question of thresholds of incident set out here, the bill both sets out the severity of the sorts of incidents that we expect reporting obligations to apply to, but at the same time ensures that it is proportionate in understanding that sector-specific thresholds ought to be precisely that, sector-specific, set closely with relevant entities in that sector and working with the expertise of the relevant regulators, and for that reason has not been specified more fully on the face of the bill. On the question of information sharing, Chair, not only is there provision for the specific sets of purposes for which information sharing ought to take place between regulators, but a further check on the proportionality of that through a particular requirement to ensure that information shared in incident contexts is done precisely for the purposes set out here and in a way that is proportionate. To my honourable friend for Milton Keynes Central in raising the question of hardware impacts in particular, whilst the focus of the bill is primarily on network and information systems, the test, as I think of it, would look at whether any compromise in network and information systems related to a piece of hardware trigger the severity of impact or potential impact to be reportable, and in the event they are reportable in their severity and potential impact, will then require notification both to the regulator and where customers are directly impacted in the way set out in the bill, then to the customers as well. And so the test is really focused on whether network and information systems are engaged and whether the impact of any incident is likely to be severe enough in light of the thresholds set out in the bill. I'm very happy to give way.
Thank you, John.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. My friend, the member for Bromsgrove, raised the case of M&F, and who would clearly be, I think, out of scope of this particular bill. However, they have a managed service provider, and so it's a bit like the JLR case. I'm still looking for some certainty as to whether JLR and M&S would come within the scope of the bill by dint of the fact that they have a managed service provider who are within scope. So I'm still not 100% clear on the answer to that question. I'd be grateful if the Minister could bring that clarity.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Well, I hope this does offer the clarity the honourable member seeks. Whilst I wouldn't apply it to specific businesses, broadly speaking, the sector of food supply is not in scope of the bill. And so the obligations on operators of essential services or direct entities in scope of the bill would not apply. However, given if, in a hypothetical situation, a managed service provider in scope of the bill supplies to that business, the managed service provider would be in scope of the bill's requirements. The customer, in this case, the food supply business, may, if the severity applies, be subject to the reporting, be in receipt of reports from the relevant MSP in this particular context, if that makes sense. So we wouldn't be caught up by the full set of obligations of the bill, but we would expect that that customer is notified of incidents where the severity thresholds are met, and I hope that gives the member clarity.
I'm grateful for the Minister giving way a second time. Just to be clear, I understand his answer that he's just given. Would an incident of the severity threshold that he referred to being reported to the client, who is out of scope, bring with it any obligation to report in the normal way?
Under the provisions of this bill alone, only those entities that are specified as operators of essential services, the relevant digital providers and so on, would be caught up in obligations extended in the instance of an event, or critical supplies. So assuming neither of those is true of a food supply business in this case, this bill's provisions would not apply to that business. Now, of course, at the same time, in the sort of incident the honourable member is describing, we would expect the NCSE would be deeply engaged, assuming severity thresholds and wider risks are applied, and we work very closely operationally in that, and I'm sure we'd look at the wider scope of how that business can be supported. But the bill's provisions are focused really on sectors and entities within those sectors that have an immediate threat to day-to-day operations in terms of potential threat to life, for example. And there are reasons which we can get into. I know we have prior, and we will later in terms of sectoral scope to figure out why we've landed where we have. Chair, I will now move to new clause 6, which seeks to clarify that a ransomware attack falls under the definition of incidents within the NIS regulations, and I very much share both the Shadow Minister and the Honourable Member for Bognor Regis' concerns about the potentially significant disruption that ransomware attacks can cause. Indeed, we've already seen the impact of the ransomware attack on Synovus, a supplier to the NHS, caused last year, resulting in a delay of 11,000 outpatient and elective procedure appointments. The Honourable Member for Bognor Regis was quite right that this kind of attack should be considered an incident under the NIS regime, and I know the Shadow Minister has made that point very clearly too. And because of the changes to incident reporting this bill introduced, I can confirm to the House that indeed ransomware attacks will be in scope here. This bill updates the definition of an incident so that it applies to any event having or capable of having an adverse effect on the operation or security of network and information systems. Ransomware attacks already fall well within this definition. In sum, whilst I welcome the principle behind new clause 6, and as I mentioned, I share the intent very much behind it, its content is already addressed by the bill, and I hope that assures honourable members across the House. Finally, Chair, I'll turn to new clause 7, which would require the government to publish a review of the new incident reporting regime within a year of this bill receiving royal assent. It is important that the effectiveness of the NIS regulations, including the reforms to incident reporting introduced by the bill, is reviewed periodically. That is why the bill requires the government to conduct a review and to lay it before Parliament once every 5 years. This timeframe will enable the new regime to bed in and allow a meaningful period of time to measure change before the government reports on the effectiveness of the incident reporting regime. And as my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent South said, notwithstanding her and the Shadow Minister's conviction in me and the government, to publish a review after only 1 year would risk giving an incomplete picture, as regulators and regulated entities may still be transitioning to the new processes set out by the bill. New Clause 7 also requires the government to publish proposals for a single reporting platform for cyber incidents, again within a year of this bill passing. Now, we've heard very clearly the ask from businesses to minimise the time that they spend filling in different reporting templates following an attack to ensure that they can prioritise a technical response. And I hear, in particular, the Honourable Member for Bognor Regis' concerns on here, which I share very much. We are exploring all options to enable a very proportionate and efficient system of reporting. That said, setting a fixed time limit of 1 year to develop those proposals in a portal does not reflect, I think, the inherent complexity of this task and the need to get it absolutely right for the businesses in scope of the bill. Not least because the proposals will need to be both rigorously evidenced, consulted on and tested. And for those reasons, Chair, I'm unable to accept this new clause into the bill.
The question is that clause 15 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that clause 16 stand part of the bill, which has just been debated. The question is that clause 16 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. And the ayes have it, the ayes have it. We now come to group 11 and the question that clause 17 stand part of the bill. The question is that clause 17 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 17 introduces new charging powers for NIS regulators, enabling them to recover the full costs of their regulatory functions under the NIS regime. This is an important reform that will help ensure that regulators are effectively funded as they take on their expanded responsibilities under the bill. It will allow them to move away from a funding model that relies on ad hoc invoicing or government grants and to approach their duties with greater confidence and certainty. The clause sets out detailed procedural requirements that determine how and when the charging powers can be used. These ensure that regulators' organisations will know what to expect from regulators. Fees will be set proportionately, and regulators will provide satisfactory accounting for the sums they have charged. The first requirement is that regulators consult and publish a charging scheme. This must specify what functions the fees are covering, the amount of fees that are being charged, or how those fees will be calculated, and the charging period they cover. Crucially, regulators will be able to set different levels of fee for different types of organisations. For example, varying charges according to size or turnover, or excluding... happy to give way.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for giving way. 2 points for the Minister to address, Chair. Firstly, can the Minister address questions or concerns around whether funds raised will be directly reinvested into improving cybersecurity rather than covering administrative overheads? And with regard to turnover, there's no specific reference to threshold. So how can the Minister be sure that a one-size-fits-all approach will not be used, causing many similar organisations to suffer financially?
Well, I very much thank the Honourable Member for those thoughtful points. On the first question, the charging scheme applies to relevant costs, and relevant costs are costs that regulators incur precisely when they carry out functions under the NIS regulations relating to cybersecurity specifically. It can include the cost of audits or inspections or handling incident reports or enforcement action, as well as other aspects such as assessments of cybersecurity and the provision of advice. It is important, I think, here to acknowledge that regulators can decide to recover costs in relation to specific functions or all their costs relating in particular to the bill's provisions. But I hope it is assurance that there is a very clear, tight scope related to their cybersecurity functions that the charging scheme applies to specifically. On the second question of the definition of turnover, I think regulators probably ought to look at turnover in a way that is sector-specific in part as well, in part because there are already a range of ways in which regulators consider the appropriate way of defining turnover relevant to those particular sectors through other regulatory regimes. And so it will be both familiar to regulators and regulated entities, the appropriate definitions for their sectors. At a later date, secondary legislation may be used if it is found necessary to set out factors that regulators ought to consider in setting up charging schemes, including the possibility of having nuanced definitions of turnover in those. Any future regulations for this purpose will be subject to consultation requirements and, of course, the affirmative procedure. I would say to the Honourable Member in relation to the point on turnover that I would expect very much at a sector level both a clarity and proportionality of both definition and charging structure. The first requirement, Chair, is that regulators consult and publish a charging scheme. This ought to specify the functions covered by the fees, the amount of fees being charged, how they're calculated, and the charging period they cover. Crucially, that regulators will be able to set different levels of fee for different types of organisations, varying them, for example, according to size or turnover, or excluding organisations from the charging scheme if it would be disproportionate or counterproductive to include them. The second requirement is to set out transparently and clearly what fees have been paid, what fees are still due, and what costs have been incurred in a given charging period. At second reading, many members discussed the need for properly resourced regulators to successfully implement the bill. I share that concern intensely. This clause seeks to achieve exactly that, in a way that is fair and proportionate to regulated organisations. For that reason, Chair, I propose that this clause stands part of the bill.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. Clause 17 amends the NIS regulations to provide a framework for regulators to impose charges on regulated entities to recover the costs incurred by them in carrying out their supervision and enforcement functions. The government's explanatory fact sheets supporting the bill suggest these changes are needed to ensure regulators are better resourced to carry out their responsibilities. We've heard at length from witnesses in all evidence sessions that resourcing is a key consideration for regulators in meeting their new and expanded obligations under this bill. And the concept of our regulators being better funded is clearly a good thing. However, much like much of this bill, the lack of detail around the regulator charging model is causing uncertainty amongst those regulated entities who will be liable to meet the associated costs. There are several aspects of the proposed charging regime which require further elaboration. These include the intention to enable authorities to recover their costs or expected costs incurred in connection with their functions. This involves a heavy degree of cost forecasting on part of the regulators, which is, of course, to be expected to a certain extent. But what guidance will be provided by government to ensure the approach to estimating costs is both transparent for regulated entities and consistent across regulators? Further, this provision establishes that charges payable by regulated entities under the scheme need not relate to the exercise of functions in relation to that particular organisation. This may be common practice at smaller level in professional regulatory models where the membership, such as doctors, lawyers and accountants, pay a fee to their regulator for their oversight functions, which may not regulate in person. And I guess on that basis I should declare an interest as someone who is registered into the GMC and therefore regulated accordingly. But in circumstances such as the regulation of cybersecurity, regulatory activity may involve protracted, technically complex investigations involving multiple personnel over many months or even years. The costs associated with that type of activity are clearly very substantial. The government said that cost recovery measures will be brought into force through secondary legislation following royal assent. This will ensure that regulators have time to prepare and conduct consultation on fee regimes. But can the Minister give any indication now on how cost recovery charging is likely to be distributed amongst sectoral entities? Will larger organisations be asked to meet a greater proportion of the costs, or will there be an element of a flat regulatory fee across all entities, which is topped up by reference to size or risk profile? Another objection that's been raised by industry stakeholders is the concern that the charging regime effectively acts as an additional operational tax, one that is at present not possible for regulated entities to ascertain or plan for as part of their own budgeting. Industry representatives have pointed out that funds allocated to regulatory fees are often diverted from operational security measures. For SMEs and mid-sized MSPs in particular, these charges represent a tangible reduction in available capital for technical controls and innovations. Any charges must therefore be transparent, proportionate and justified. Another concern is that a regulator funded by organisations within the remit of its oversight may have reduced incentives to prioritise efficiency in the exercise of their duties. In planning this funding model, which comparable regulatory regimes has the government looked at for inspiration? Which regulators are regarded as successful in their approach to oversight and enforcement, and is there any correlation with this and their funding models? Thank you.
Minister to respond.
Thank you, Chair. And in particular, there were two main questions that the Shadow Minister raised, which I'm keen on addressing. The first was to ensure that I was committing to next steps on potential guidance for the charging scheme. The government, I can confirm, will issue guidance for competent authorities. That will include general directions on how the fee regime ought to be implemented. At the same time, we do not intend to be prescriptive as to how competent authorities should recover costs to benefit. From their experience and practice in setting up these regimes, it is, I think, important that each regulator is able to tailor their fee regime in a way consistent and complementary with the state of their sector. I'm happy to give up.
Thank you, John.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. I don't know whether he's had a chance, on the subject of charging and money, I don't know whether he's had the opportunity to revisit his own impact assessment since we discussed it last week, which on multiple occasions refers to the hourly salary of a contract lawyer being £34 an hour. I contended last time that this was totally unrealistic, probably to the factor of 10. And so has the Minister had a chance to re-look at that? And undertake to revisit his own impact assessment on the basis that it might have a glitch in the matrix.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I'm well reminded of the Honourable Member's point from last week. I'm very happy to write to him on the basis of the precise figure in the impact assessment, which I understand to be not just based on an extensive survey, but applying subsequent uplifts to it as well, and I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation in correspondence. Chair, on the particular question as to the factors that ought to be considered in setting up charging schemes, I've mentioned some of them in the course of my speech, but would flag simply that these are suggestive and indicative rather than exhaustive of factors that regulators may consider. They ought to be able to set different levels of fee for different types of organisations, and I mentioned size or turnover being some. There is also provision to exclude organisations from the charging scheme altogether if it would be disproportionate or counterproductive to include them. And I think it's appropriate that regulators and competent authorities have the ability to vary their charging schemes in light of that. On the particular question of looking at regulatory performance at the moment and its correlation with charging schemes, I mean, the simple thing I'd say is that I haven't personally observed any direct correlation. What I have seen simply is clearly some regulators are doing well. We heard in the context of the evidence as well from a range of participants that in some places things were working particularly well, in some there was more scope for improvement, and that is precisely why this bill has set no fundamental kind of lowest common denominator for how regulators ought to approach either charging or their enforcement duties, but instead to make sure that we are conducting oversight of each regulator in as robust a way as possible. And so for those reasons, Chair, I would simply move Clause 17 and assure members across the House that the question of regulatory enforcement is a central one, and the motivation behind the charging scheme is precisely to ensure that our regulators are well resourced to implement this bill.
The question is that Clause 17 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 12 and Government Amendment 14 to Clause 18, with which it will be convenient to consider Government Amendments 15 to 18 and Clause 18. I call the Minister to move Government Amendment 14.
Thank you, Chair, and I will, with your permission, begin by discussing Clause 18. Clause 18 introduces vital reforms to how information can be shared in the context of the NIS framework. Right now, the NIS regulations have limitations which restrict how and with whom information can be shared. We've heard this again and again, both from honourable members across the House and from witnesses. This has serious implications for the effectiveness and efficiency of the regime, business burdens, as well as the ability of the UK's authorities to act on national security or criminal intelligence. One important limitation in the current regulations is the inability of regulators to share information with many public authorities in the UK and vice versa. For example, NIS regulators would currently not be able to share information to support the evaluation of the NIS framework or policy development relating to cyber resilience and national security. The clause addresses these concerns by enabling information to be shared between NIS regulators and UK public authorities, including the government. This will be done both for the purposes of supporting the NIS regulations, as well as wider objectives like reducing business burdens and for national security and crime purposes. I should add that this clause also imposes strict requirements and safeguards on how this information can be further shared. The net effect of these changes will be fewer burdens on business, better and more informed regulatory decision-making, joined-up incident response, and improved security for the United Kingdom. Government Amendment 14 makes targeted but important changes to Clause 18. This amendment now proposes a further ground for sharing information, focused on wider cybersecurity and resilience outside the context of the NIS regulations and NIS sectors. In practice, it means that NIS regulators will be able to share information with regulators who are responsible for overseeing the cybersecurity and resilience of other vital sectors under different regulatory frameworks and vice versa. This is a crucial addition to the bill. It means that the UK's regulators can now think holistically about the risks that their sectors are facing, the interventions they are proposing to take, and the obligations they are placing on business. This in turn will mean better outcomes, more effective and informed incident response, more coordinated oversight, lower business burdens. The amendment will be particularly important in supporting coordination with the financial regulators responsible for the critical third parties regime, which could be used to designate organisations already in scope of the NIS regulations such as cloud service providers. But it also anticipates the need for coordination with other sectors, such as civil, nuclear and space in the future. In short, the amendment is necessary to ensure that the UK regulators can take a more coordinated approach to protecting the UK's most essential services. Further, Government Amendments 15 to 18 are consequential to Government Amendment 14. I urge the committee to support Amendments 14 to 18 and propose that Clause 18 stands part of the bill.
Government Amendment 14 proposed Clause 18 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. This clause, which the Government seeks to modify for its amendments 14 to 18, creates new pathways for information sharing between regulators, public authorities and government departments. It also creates a power for NIS enforcement authorities to share information with relevant overseas authorities for specified purposes. This new regime is intended to remove gaps and ambiguities in the existing framework governing the sharing of information obtained in the course of competent authorities and NCSC's oversight role and create legal certainty in this domain. In turn, it's anticipated that greater information sharing will assist with the detection of crime, enforcement activity, awareness of emerging cyber risks and ascertaining the effectiveness of the NIS regulations in building UK cyber resilience. In particular, the bill creates a new gateway to ensure NIS regulators can share information with UK public authorities and vice versa, share and receive information from organisations outside of the NIS framework, such as other regulators and bodies such as Companies House, and share information with UK government departments. The bill strengthens safeguards on how information can be used once it's been shared under the NIS regulations by restricting onward disclosure. More effective information sharing will be vital for competent authorities to keep up to date with emerging risks and building resilience in their sectors. Indeed, these new measures were broadly welcomed by regulators in your oral evidence sessions. However, industry bodies such as Tech UK have called for further detail around the new information sharing regime. In particular, I ask what steps the government is taking to ensure that regulators share responsibility for protecting sensitive data and that information sharing processes are coherent, proportionate and secure. Can the Minister elaborate on discussions he has had with regulators on these matters and how secure information sharing will actually work in practice? And finally, I'll just come to some of the detail in terms of the text of Government Amendment 14. And I can see, in terms of AA subsection 2, otherwise in connection with, and the lines of the amendment are any other matter relating to cybersecurity and resilience. Given that this is an information sharing power, this seems remarkably broad as an any other matter clause. Would it be possible for the Minister to lay out what sort of disclosures does he conceive come within the scope of that isn't already on the face of the bill, and what guidance or consultation will he do to make sure such powers are proportionate and not at risk of abuse? Thank you.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I really welcome both the amendments from the government and the Clause 18. I think it's very, very important in order to be able to share our vulnerabilities in an appropriate way with those people that may be involved. But again, some of the aspects that have been raised with us, particularly by the security services like GCHQ and HMGCC and others, will relate to both foreign interference but also potential foreign interference through technology that is embedded within our networks. Again, I just wanted to raise the question again about how the Minister sees this working within that cooperation, particularly during this volatile times with different foreign nations. Thank you.
Minister to respond.
Thank you, Chair. And in response to the first question from the Shadow Minister about ensuring sensitive handling of shared information as well as its proportionality, all information handled by regulators ought to be treated carefully and with awareness of its importance. The regulators have to act reasonably, and the NIS regulations specifically require information obtained from inspections to be held securely. Of course, data protection laws also apply to regulators as well. Alongside that, regulators will also be required to consider the relevance and proportionality to the purposes set out in the bill of sharing their information. And the legislation here includes specific purposes, as I had mentioned, for why information might be shared. On the broader concern raised on both sides about ensuring both that the grounds for further sharing are tightly scoped, as the Shadow Minister suggested, and as my honourable friend, the member for Milton Keynes Central, suggested, that they're still sufficiently expansive to allow us to cater to a range of attack vectors, not least hostile states and associated actors. The motivation is perhaps helpful to set out, Chair, in the amendment in question. We have been engaging very closely with both relevant regulators and departments as we develop and prepare this tabling of the bill, and feedback from those discussions has demonstrated the need to make changes here. That is why we're acting promptly to ensure that they are reflected in the bill. I will also say that the amendment specifically permits NIS regulators to share information with other public authorities for the purposes of cybersecurity and resilience, and only where the information shared is proportionate and relevant to the purpose set out in the bill as well. I wouldn't want to specify with prescriptive detail what that is, precisely in light of the concern raised by my honourable friend from Milton Keynes Central about the varying nature of attack vectors for cybersecurity. But I hope it is some assurance that the amendment in question has been developed very closely working with relevant regulators.
Government Amendment 14, proposed clause 18 as on the amendment paper. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Government Amendment 15 to clause 18, which has already been debated. With the leave of the committee, I shall put a single question on Government Amendments 15 to 18, which have already been debated. No objections, Minister, to move formally?
Formally.
The question is that the Government Amendments 15 to 18 be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Amendment 9 to clause 15, which has already been debated. Does anyone wish to push the amendment to a vote? I see that nobody does. We now come to the question that clause 18 as amended stand part of the bill, which has already been debated. The question is that clause 18 as amended stand part of the bill. As many are as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to group 13 and the question that clause 19 stand part of the bill. The question is that clause 19 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 19 sets out that regulators must provide guidance on specific issues, including security requirements and incident reporting notifications. Guidance already plays an important role in supporting the implementation of the NIS regime. However, we have identified some areas where regulated entities would benefit from additional clarity. Clause 19 ensures that every regulated sector has the guidance they need from their sectoral regulators to help them to comply. To ensure consistency across regulators, Clause 19 also requires regulators to coordinate with each other when preparing guidance relating to designating critical suppliers. This clause also requires regulators to consider guidance published by the Secretary of State, such as the Code of Practice, when preparing guidance on security and resilience requirements. This will ensure that regulators consider good practice recommendations and take more consistent approaches to preparing guidance. I propose that this clause stands as part of the bill.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. Clause 19 amends the NIS regulations and will require regulators to publish guidance on the security and incident reporting requirements of regulated sectors. In formulating their guidance, sector regulators are under a duty to coordinate and consult with other regulators to ensure consistency as far as reasonably possible. Relevant provisions in the Code of Practice to be issued by the Secretary of State under Clause 36 must also be taken into account. Newly regulated entities will no doubt welcome proportionate guidance on meeting their obligations, and existing regulated entities will appreciate any streamlining that comes from consultation between regulators and their approach. Can the Minister provide further details about whether consultation between regulators and the Secretary of State is underway on a consistent approach to regulation?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. As I've mentioned to the Shadow Minister, both ministers in the other place, the Minister for Digital Economy and the Secretary of State, have engaged with a number of the regulators in scope here, and both those conversations and the broader framework of this bill is intended to drive consistency across sectors through both common security requirements, clear guidance, and a statement of strategic priorities which will set objectives that regulators must seek to achieve. I hope that is sufficient assurance that not only the conversations have started, but there will be a fundamental focus as we ensure consistent regulation across the bill.
The question is that Clause 19 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 14 and the question that Clause 20 stand part of the bill. The question is that Clause 20 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 20 introduces important updates to the information gathering powers that regulators have under the NIS regime. It ensures that regulators are able to collect any information that they might reasonably require to exercise or to decide whether to exercise their functions under the regulations. While the clause sets out some of the purposes for which a regulator might particularly wish to collect information, for example, to determine whether an organisation should be designated as a critical supplier, this is an explicitly non-exhaustive list. The clause also allows regulators to collect information through issuing an information notice. It sets out details that must be included in an information notice and the form that the notice could take. An information notice must, for example, explain why the information is being sought and the form in which the information must be provided. New Regulation 15A, as introduced by the clause, makes clear that an information notice could be given to an organisation based outside of the UK and apply to information held outside of the UK. An information notice could require the obtaining, generating, collecting or retaining of information or documents. These changes are all critical in ensuring that our regulators can access the information they need to properly enforce the NIS regulations. I propose that this clause stands part of the bill.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Can the Minister elaborate on how regulators will have, or how he'll ensure that regulators have the capacity to cope with large-scale data reports?
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. Clause 20 grants regulators wide-ranging information gathering powers, both in relation to regulated entities and organisations currently outside the scope of regulations. These new powers will be important to competent authorities in gaining access to the information necessary to consider which businesses should be designated critical suppliers for their sectors. And the Minister, remember, we had a very extensive discussion about the allocation or not of critical suppliers. What assurance can he give that requests for information under this new clause would be exercised proportionately? Now, this is especially relevant for SMEs that might struggle administratively to meet broad requests for information within short deadlines. But, and I know I'll be told off by the Chair if I try and rehash the previous Clause 12 debate. But one of the points that I made during that debate is that the scope of what could come under a critical supplier could be, in my view, any supplier to an operator of an essential service. And so potentially requests for information under this provision could be incredibly broad. Can he give some reassurances in terms of how this will actually work in practice and the proportionality of data collection? Would it be like what the concern is, would it be like a fishing dredging exercise rather than something that's targeted and proportionate to the most high-risk suppliers?
You can drop.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of scope, could the Minister give us some sense when it comes to managed service providers, whether the purpose behind this clause is to enable regulators to find out from managed service providers their entire client list? I'd be grateful for some clarity on that point.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and I will take each of those three questions in order. So the Honourable Member from Bromsgrove raised a very important point, shared, I think, in sentiment across the House about ensuring that regulators have the capacity to deal with the volume and quality of information they might receive under the provisions of this clause. And precisely for that reason, we have set out a charging scheme possibility here that allows regulators to be able to equip themselves. Of course, that is simply an initial question of resourcing rather than a question of the quality of that resourcing and capability of it, and so we will continue to ensure that through our oversight of regulators in appropriate ways, we are pressing home the importance of enforcement quality and regulatory capability. To the Shadow Minister's point on proportionality, I share very much that focus on ensuring that the designation, and not least for critical suppliers and information requirements of them, are proportionate. I will also avoid, like him, repeating the prior debate, but the 5-step test we had for the designation of critical suppliers, combined with the fact that the bill allows for secondary legislation and guidance to specify much more proportionate burdens on them rather than for key regulated entities, alongside the fact that information notices themselves ought to be proportionate and focus primarily on the purposes of the bill's provisions, gives me, and I hope him, assurance about the proportionality embedded in the provisions of the bill.
Would you give him that point?
Happy to give away.
I'm very grateful for him giving away this point. Could he talk through what the sort of data exchange flowchart would look like? So how is this going to actually work in practice? Is it that the OASs are going to proactively contact the regulator and saying, we have all these suppliers, go play? Is it that the regulator is going to contact the OES and say, give us a list of all your suppliers, then we're going to start an investigation program and decide what data we need? What is the direction of communication for this operating in practice? Or is it, perhaps even worse, is it that suppliers to an OES, the burden is going to be on them to contact the regulator to say, could we possibly be in scope? How does he see this shaking out in practice?
Whilst I wouldn't specify prescriptively what the activity and flow ought to be, I can certainly share from kind of my experience a mechanism. I think many large-scale businesses, indeed many medium and small-sized businesses, have a very clear business continuity plan mapping their critical suppliers. I would expect in this case the regulator and regulated entities to engage. Who sends the email first is an open question. I wouldn't want to specify it on the face of the bill, but I would expect very much each regulator for their regulated entities to work very closely in understanding critical suppliers that meet the tests specified in the bill, and as a consequence to engage with those critical suppliers as well. I'm happy to go away.
He's mentioned business continuity plan a second time in terms of justification for not going into details on this, but the whole point about the reason the government's bringing the powers in Clause 12 and the designation of suppliers is because there was no business continuity plan put in place with the example of Synovus. So I don't see how that's a sort of argument to get away from the important need for clarity for organisations who could be at risk of being within scope of being assessed and designated as a critical supplier, to know what actions they have to take proactively or otherwise in response to regulation, and of course the burdens on them which are going to be required. And we've just discussed in the previous causes the cost of enforcement and what potentially risks becoming essentially a cybersecurity tax.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I wouldn't want to imply that every organisation has one of these, but the simple point is that the framework for assessing critical third-party suppliers is very established in business. It is very established in other regulatory regimes, as I've mentioned. And so the novelty or ambiguity that the Shadow Minister might suggest simply doesn't apply. Now, of course, that is not to say that there will be cases in which new critical third-party suppliers will be designated. That is the point of the purpose in the bill, of the provisions in the bill. But I expect it will be a practice that will, of course, need rigour, of course, need efficiency and proportionality, but will be grounded in very existing, widely understood frameworks. The Honourable Member for Spelthorne, in particular, I'm going to have to be reminded by him of his question, so if I might ask him for it.
Thank you, John. I'm going to have to remind myself of the question. I asked the Minister whether it was the purpose of this clause for a regulator to be able to ask a managed service provider who their entire client list is in order to make various assessments.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for both making and repeating the question. The purposes of the provisions on information requirements are really focused on ensuring regulators can conduct their duties as provided by the bill. And so I would not expect information notices to require an exhaustive list in every instance, but primarily to focus on a more proportionate set of asks which relate to risk vectors to both the security of those regulated entities and wider national security and cybersecurity.
The question is that clause 20 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. No, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to group 15 and the question that clause 21 stand part of the bill. The question is that clause 21 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 21 reforms the enforcement regime for the NIS regulations. It seeks to ensure that providers of the UK's most essential services are complying with their obligations under the NIS regulations. Where they're not, it will allow for more meaningful penalties that reflect the risks they introduce to our society and economy as a whole. To do this, the clause makes a number of critical changes. First, it introduces a new penalty maximum based on turnover. The current maximum penalty is 17 million, which can appear disproportionately large for small organisations, but could also easily be absorbed by larger ones as the cost of doing business. The clause therefore increases the penalty limits from 17 million to a maximum of 17 million or 4% of annual turnover, whichever is higher. I'm confident that this strikes the right balance within the UK regulatory context. It brings the regime in line with other UK legislation that regulates cybersecurity, such as Part 1 of the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act 2022, without rushing uncritically to the more severe penalties we see in other CNI regulation. The second change is to create a simple two-band penalty structure that will provide much-needed clarity to regulators and industry about the penalty tiers for specific acts of non-compliance.
Will the Minister give way?
In particular, happy to give way.
Bradley Thomas.
I thank the Minister for giving way. On the point of the banding, what assurance can the Minister give that there will be consistency applied across regulators so that different events aren't differentially penalised depending on the regulatory body? And on the question around the turnover point and the financial penalty, can the Minister just elaborate on how that figure was derived?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for Bromsgrove on both fronts. On the question of the penalty bands, there are clearly defined parameters set out on the face of the bill about the penalty bands, and my hope is that that increases both the effectiveness, the clarity, but at the heart of it, to his question, the consistency which we expect across regulatory regimes in the application of it. And in terms of arriving at the 4% figure, the maximum penalty, as I mentioned, it was in part a reference to existing UK regulatory regimes and legislation that was felt most comparable. In part, it was judged to be an appropriate proportionate maximum based on relevant concerns around what is an appropriate level of deterrent effect, what is a proportionate level of fine, what is the, as I mentioned, the regulatory precedence here, but also the broader impact on investment and the economy as a whole, notwithstanding the very significant costs that businesses already experience in terms of cybersecurity costs to them as well. Chair, in particular, I mentioned the second change here was intended to eliminate the confusion surrounding the definition of a material contravention in the current regulations. Finally, the clause ensures that regulators can consider a wider range of factors when determining what constitutes an appropriate penalty. Where mitigating steps have been taken to address a breach, this should be acknowledged. But so too should the impacts of the breach and any history of compliance or non-compliance. To conclude, an effective regulatory regime must be backed by fair but effective penalties to ensure it is followed. This clause ensures, I'm happy to give way.
Thank you, John.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, because this is really where the regulatory rubber hits the road. And in the cases that we've described earlier, where we have a client who is not in scope for the bill, and they employ a managed service provider who is in scope for the bill and is therefore susceptible, vulnerable to these charges, what is going to be the situation where the operation of an IT system by a client employee, there is an interface between what the managed service provider does and someone brings in a data stick, shoves it in the side of the computer in breaking their sort of rules, and it elicits some form of ransomware. How is that going to work when the regulator goes down to the managed service provider and says, here's your £10 million fine, and the client is going to say, that is down to you? It's going to be a lawyer fest, isn't it? And even lawyers who get paid more than £34 an hour are going to make quite a lot of money.
Thank you, Chair. Just so I'm clear, not least for future records, I think the case described is where the client is not in scope of the bill, but is provided to by an MSP which is in scope of the bill. and the relevant responsible individual is in the client business as an employee or agent of that business. It's an important point he raises. The focus of this bill, clearly both in its obligations as well as its fine focus, is on regulated entities. In this instance, if the individual is not in the regulated entity and the regulated entity in itself has complied with the entirety of the reporting obligations and the wider cybersecurity obligations in the bill, we would look to other venues of legal action against the individual in question, and it would be challenging for a bill which doesn't regulate the entire economy to ensure that every individual and other firms unregulated in it are brought into the scope of it as well. But it is not to diminish the significance of requiring other pieces of law to act on individuals elsewhere.
On this, would you give way?
Minister.
Very grateful for giving way, and obviously I'll be doing my speech, but just as we're having a debate on this particular point, doesn't the answer he's just given risk essentially a gilded defensive posture being set up by MSPs, where if they list T's and C's for the use of their services, which essentially bar everything, then that way they can say that any liability, if there's a ransomware, they get hacked, is completely on the client as opposed to the MSP themselves. So isn't the way he just explained that essentially at risk of creating a situation where the MSPs will take a very, very defensive posture to ensure that the client gets liability in the context of any problem, and given the clients usually aren't regulated entities, then effectively this becomes meaningless?
Minister.
I can see the hypothetical point he raises, but I would assure the Shadow Minister that, one, if there is some universal and consistent practice by an MSP to avoid liability where liability ought to reside with them as well, that ought to be in scope of how the regulator assesses the performance of that MSP. And second, I would assure him that the MSP market remains a market where there is a degree of competition, which means that given the attractiveness of the UK customer and end user market for MSPs, I would expect very much that any MSP that is adopting a falsely defensive posture of the sort he describes would not only be assessed so by the regulator, but also would fall foul of the competitive market context that I think we have and want to ensure in the UK. So to conclude, Chair, an effective regulatory regime must be backed by fair but effective penalties to ensure it is followed. This clause ensures this is the case for NIS regulations, and for that reason I propose that this clause stands part of the bill.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. I think I'm going to follow up in writing on that intervention I just did to try and dig down into the explanation given, because I do think this is an important point in terms of laying down liability when the client is not a regulated entity but is receiving services from a regulated entity, because these are quite hefty fines that are, and as my honourable friend, the member for Spelthorne pointed out, there will be a lot of even with the £34 an hour lawyers, there'll be a lot of industry activity to try and avoid finding themselves liable in the context of a substantial cyber breach, which we know can be very significant. But coming to the Clause 21 specific, more generally, it makes significant changes to enforcement practices under the NIS regulations, including to increase the amount of financial penalties regulators can impose for infringement of the NIS regulations, and to set out a clearer system for a tiered approach to penalties based on the severity of infringements. The government's impact assessment for the bill states that these changes have been made because of concerns reported by regulators that enforcement under NIS regulations has been constrained by unclear band structures and a maximum penalty which is insufficient to deter non-compliance across all NIS sectors. Going back to my previous point, Chair, enforcement activity under the NIS regulations has been sparse, it's been inconsistent, and it's been insufficiently effective to increase cyber resilience to the levels necessary to meet the proliferating cybersecurity risks to our most critical sectors. Fundamentally, the existing approach to enforcement has not achieved the necessary change in attitude to cyber risk at the highest levels of regulated entities. It's concerning that board-level responsibility for cybersecurity has steadily declined among businesses since 2021, with 38% of businesses having a board member of responsibility for cybersecurity in 2021, compared to 27% in 2025. The enforcement model clearly needs to be more effective, and increasing fines is only one part of that. Regulatory capacity to undertake supervision and enforcement remains a concern, as does perceived reticence on behalf of the regulators to impose fines on critical infrastructure providers due to the risk of destabilising essential services and increasing costs for consumers. At the all evidence sessions, many witnesses, including Richard Starnes of the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists, raised the issue of greater responsibility at the highest levels of management for cyber resilience. What assessment has the Secretary of State undertaken of whether changes to the penalty regime is likely to influence board-level attitudes towards cybersecurity?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I think the Shadow Minister's point is a really important one, which is that cybersecurity must be taken seriously at the highest level, at the board level in organisations. It is a part of the assessment under the cyber assessment framework, which the government has put at the heart of how we think about the assessment of cybersecurity in firms as well as public sector organisations. It is also part of increasingly the guidance that government is looking at, both in terms of the cyber action plan and a wider cybersecurity strategy, and I take those points very seriously. In terms of the particular assessment on making sure that businesses are razor-sharp focused on it, it is of course the intent of the fine regime to ensure there is a deterrent effect, and that deterrent effect is felt at the levels of decision making which must reside with boards as well.
The question is that Clause 21 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 16, and the question of Clause 22 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Government Amendments 19 Schedule 1. The question is that Clause 22 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 22 sets out through Schedule 1 consequential changes to the regulations in relation to enforcement and appeals. This is to ensure that these regulations work effectively in relation to the new entities brought into scope, such as managed service providers, data centres and large load controllers. This will ensure that enforcement and appeal systems work as intended. Amendment 19, in my name, makes a minor drafting correction, and I propose that Clause 22 and Schedule 1 stand part of the bill.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Nothing further to add.
The question is that Clause 22 stand part of the bill. As many are of that opinion say aye. No. The ayes have it. We now come to Government Amendment 19 to Schedule 1, which has just been debated. Minister, can you informally?
Ready to move.
Government Amendment 19 proposed Schedule 1. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the question that Schedule 1 as amended be the first schedule to the bill, which has already been debated. The question is that Schedule 1 as amended be the first schedule to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Group 17 and the question that Clause 23 stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate the Government Amendments 20, 21 and 22 and Schedule 2. The question is that Clause 23 stand part of the bill. Call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 23 introduces Schedule 2, which introduces a number of minor and consequential amendments to the NIS regulations, necessitated by the more substantive changes introduced by this bill. Amongst other technical changes, Schedule 2 revokes assimilated EU legislation, removes the requirement for a NIS national strategy to be published once a statement of strategic priorities has been designated in its place, and updates references in the regulations to reflect the new clause numbering. Amendments 20 and 21, tabled in my name, make minor drafting corrections. Amendment 22, tabled in my name, aligns the process for issuing documents, notices and directions under the NIS regulations with Clause 57 of the bill as amended by Amendments 23 and 24. As it stands, regulators will be required to follow two different procedures for issuing documents, notices and directions under the NIS regulations and issuing them under the national security powers in Part 4 of the bill. This is unnecessarily confusing for regulators and for regulated entities. Government Amendment 22 resolves this issue by aligning Regulation 24 with Clause 57 as amended by Amendments 23 and 24. I urge the Committee to support Amendments 20, 21 and 22, and I propose that Clause 23 and Schedule 2 stand part of the bill.
No, thank you, Chair. Before, nothing further to add.
The question is that Clause 23 stand part of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Government Amendment 20 to Schedule 2, which has just been debated. With the leave of the committee, I shall put a single question on Government Amendments 20 to 22, which have already been debated. Minister, to move formally. The question is that Government Amendments 20 to 22 be made. As many of that opinion say aye, the contrary no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. We now come to the question that Schedule 2 as amended be the second schedule to the bill which has already been debated. The question is that Schedule 2 as amended be the second schedule of the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye, the contrary no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. We now come to Group 18 and the question that Clause 24 stand part of the bill with which it will be convenient to debate new Clause 1, 8, 9, 11 and 12. The question is that Clause 24 stand part of the bill. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Clause 24 defines key terms for this part of the bill and in doing so introduces 2 delegated powers. These powers enable the government to bring new sectors into scope of the NIS regime and designate regulators to oversee them. This power will only be used in relation to activities that are truly essential to our society and economy. In other words, where disruption could pose risks to life or the economic stability of the UK. These powers are essential in the rapidly changing world we occupy. As we have seen with data centres and managed service providers, our society and economy can quickly become reliant on new services which are acutely vulnerable to cyber attacks and system outages. Our legislation must be able to keep up with these changes and protect the services that matter most to our country. Chair, I will deal with the amendments if they're tabled and discussed, so I will pause there.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. I want to use new Clause 1 in this group as a lens on a wider question that sits underneath Clause 24, rather than as a verdict on the clause itself. That question is how we decide, in a disciplined and credible way, which activities are sufficient... which activities are sufficiently critical to be brought into scope of this regime and how that judgment is applied consistently over time. New Clause 1 would bring much of the food supply chain directly into scope through primary legislation. I understand the instincts behind that. Food supply is fundamental to public confidence and disruption would be felt very quickly. But the underlying test for inclusion is systemic impact. So if the underlying test for inclusion is systemic impact, then food is not the only sector that raises those questions. I'm Vice Chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, and over the last year, we've taken evidence on economic security from major UK firms that have experienced serious cyber incidents. And one example that everyone here will be familiar with is Jaguar Land Rover. Evidence to our committee indicated that the cyber incident there contributed to UK GDP in the third quarter last year being around 0.1% lower than expected. This was not a marginal effect. It reflected disruption to tightly integrated manufacturing systems, production lines being brought to a halt, and knock-on impacts across just-in-time supply chains and regional economies. I make that point to underline something simple. Cyber risk now presents simultaneously as operational risk, financial risk, and reputational risk. And in combination, those effects can be felt economy-wide. If that's the rationale for bringing food into scope early, then it inevitably raises questions about other high-value sectors where a single incident can have national economic consequences. And that brings us back to Clause 24 and the role of the Secretary of State. The bill is clearly designed to allow scope to evolve through secondary legislation as risks change, and that flexibility is sensible. But flexibility only works if the criteria for widening scope are clear, predictable, and capable of being explained to industry, regulators, and Parliament. If decisions appear reactive or driven by the most recent or most visible incident, confidence in the regime will suffer rather than strengthen. And that concern is reflected in the written evidence we've received. The Association of British Insurers, for example, supports higher standards of cyber resilience, but it also emphasises the importance of clear definitions and coherence between regimes, particularly where firms are already subject to overlapping regulatory requirements. Their point is not about resisting regulation, but about avoiding uncertainty and duplication that does not improve resilience. So my questions are ones of principle rather than position. First, what is the settled test the Secretary of State will apply when deciding to bring a sector into scope under Clause 24 powers? And how will that judgment be made transparent to Parliament? Second, if Parliament were to require rapid expansion of scope, how confident is the government that regulators would have the capacity to supervise a much larger and more diverse population without diluting oversight elsewhere? I'm not seeking to land a conclusion on new Clause 1 today myself. I understand why it's been tabled and I recognise the seriousness of the issues it highlights. But if we are going to widen scope, food or otherwise, the committee is entitled to press the government on the discipline and guardrails that will sit behind those decisions. This needs to remain a targeted and credible regime rather than one that expands without a clear and consistent logic. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chadwick, did you want to come into this?
Clarifying, Chair, that I'd like to speak to amendments NC8 to NC12, NC9 even. Is this the appropriate time? Thank you very much, Chair. These amendments will close a dangerous gap at the heart of the government's cybersecurity strategy. Right now, the bill creates a two-tier system. Private companies running critical national infrastructure face strict legal duties, enforcement and oversight. Yet, the very public institutions that hold our democracy together and protect some of our most vulnerable citizens are left outside statutory protection. And nowhere is that more alarming than with our local authorities. And indeed, that's where the approach that this government is taking diverges from some EU member states. The Netherlands, for example, are applying their equivalent legislation to local authorities. When a council suffers a cyber attack, it's not just an IT inconvenience. That means real life grinding to a halt. And I'm sure that there are members here who have served on local authorities, and they'll be very well aware that a cyber attack hitting a local authority creates problems with welfare payments, housing services, processing the payment of benefits, accessing social care for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, Chair, and problems collecting bins. Clearly, these are crucial activities to day-to-day life within our society and within our democracy. A cyber attack can leave families left without support, vulnerable children without protection, and elderly residents without care. Yet the Minister has suggested that these services are not necessary to the day-to-day functioning of society, and that's a point with which I disagree. We've already seen the consequences at Tewkesbury Borough Council, where a cyber attack was so severe that it triggered a major incident and crippled core services. Likewise with the attack on Gloucester Council, which cost the taxpayer over £1 million and put at risk some of the most sensitive information held on UK residents, particularly if one considers the nature of employment in Gloucestershire. And the reporting from those attacks showed that local authorities, which are cash-strapped and struggling to make do as they are, had to divert lots of resources, staffing resources, into getting to grips with the incidents that are taking place. Yes, absolutely.
I thank the member for giving way. I've got much sympathy with the arguments that he's making about the importance of local government and believe that it should be within the scope of this. Essential services are provided by councils on a day-to-day basis, but local councils are increasingly cash-strapped. Does he share my concern about the burden of compliance falling on councils, many of which differ in size and scale to their adjacent neighbours? They've got differing degrees of IT infrastructure capability. So there runs the risk of increased compliance burdens at a time that councils may already have stretched budgets and a lack of resource and capacity within the system to accommodate additional compliance and regulatory burden.
Thank him for his intervention, and he makes an important point. These are services that we simply cannot allow to be interrupted. I mean, he'll be well aware of the impact of bins not being collected and the impact that that has on our streets. Councils are being targeted precisely because they hold sensitive personal data and provide much needed services to the most vulnerable in society, and yet currently they're being left as soft targets without statutory requirements and the ring-fenced resources that accompany them. But we cannot claim to be building a cyber-secure Britain while leaving the front line of public services unprotected. Resilience must extend beyond councils. Our amendments also ask that our political parties and our electoral infrastructure are properly protected, because we know that hostile states and non-state actors are actively seeking to undermine democratic systems. An attack does not need to change an electoral result to be devastating. It only needs to cast doubt on the integrity of the count or prevent legitimate voters from casting their ballots. And trust, as we know, once lost, is extraordinarily hard to rebuild. The security of our elections is too important to be left to secondary legislation at some future date. And finally, our amendments require the government to bring critical manufacturing, food production and large-scale retail distribution into scope. Because when British companies like JLR lose billions to cyber incidents, or when national retailers like Marks and Spencer's are paralysed, this isn't just a private commercial issue, it's a blow to national economic security, and there's no economic security without cyber security. The Minister will be very aware that the ramifications of the JLR attack were felt across South Wales because of the link to the supply chain in the steel industry. Our neighbours in the European Union are already recognised this through the NIS2 framework, which covers food production and transport manufacturing as essential sectors. This amendment simply asks the government to match that seriousness. So at its heart, the amendments we ask for are about ending a two-tier approach. We seek the government's recognition that councils, our political parties and our electoral infrastructure and core supply chains are just as critical to national resilience as power stations and data centres, because a country is not secure if its public services at any level are exposed. Its elections are vulnerable and its economy can be brought to a standstill by a single cyber attack. These amendments hope to close those gaps and make Britain safer.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a very important part of this bill. Part 3 of the bill gives the Secretary of State a range of powers, including to bring additional sectors within the scope of the regulation, to update NIS regulations, to publish statements of strategic priorities for regulators, and to publish codes of practice setting out cybersecurity measures for entities to comply with their regulatory duties. Clause 24 includes a power enabling the Secretary of State to specify new services that can be brought into scope of the NIS regulations and to designate additional regulatory authorities. These powers are intended to allow the Secretary of State to identify additional critical sectors and respond to emerging threats quickly. This agility has been broadly welcomed as an appropriate measure given the fast-evolving nature of malicious cyber activity. Given the extent of the Secretary of State's new powers, however, it is important that guardrails are in place to ensure that further regulation is indeed the appropriate response to emerging threats, rather than market-led or insurance-based mitigations. Is the Minister able to provide any further information at this stage about the procedure that will be followed in deciding whether to expand the scope of regulation to ensure consistency and transparency? Honourable members have tabled several new clauses that would prompt the Secretary of State to use her duties under this Clause 24. If I may, Chair, I will speak to new Clause 1, tabled in the name of the Honourable Member for Warwick and Leamington, and new Clause 9, tabled in the name of the Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnor, together as they have some thematic overlap. New Clause 1 seeks to bring all entities other than small and micro businesses in the food production, distribution and retail supply chain within the scope of regulation as operators of essential services. New Clause 9 also touches on the regulation of food supply chains. It requires the Secretary of State to designate retailers of food and essential goods when part of a large-scale distribution chain and manufacturers of critical transport equipment as providers of essential services to be brought within the scope of regulation. These new clauses reflect concerns regarding targeting of food retailers, M&S and Co-op by cyber attacks last year. And in respect of new clause 9, this reflects issues raised by the major attack on JLR, which caused such disruption and threatened the stability of regional jobs and supply chains. These attacks caused significant public concern, and all would remain out of scope even after this bill comes into effect. As to the question of bringing food retailers within scope, we in the UK are fortunate to have a diverse and competitive supermarket and smaller food retail sector. Consumers in many areas of the country can find ready alternatives in the event disruption to supply chains interrupts their ability to access their usual supermarket or grocer. And as such, there is an argument about whether supply chain entities in this sector necessarily share the same criticality profile of other sectors regulated by the NISREGs to warrant the regulatory burden on businesses or bringing them within scope. This is particularly so given the low threshold applied in New Clause 1, where only small and micro businesses would escape regulation. This approach would place the costs and complexity of complying with regulation on any business exceeding 50 staff members. However, I do think the position of individual supply chain entities in very remote or underserved communities where consumers do have little or no choice should be looked at more closely by government. In terms of the impact of expanding sectoral scope of regulation in this way, we've already heard in oral evidence some of the challenges faced by regulators in ensuring that they have sufficient, suitably skilled cybersecurity professionals to ensure an effective approach to regulation. My understanding is that there's a limited pool of such expertise, and it should clearly be deployed to address risk in the most critical sectors and companies. In this regard, there may well be a case for regulation in respect of the very largest out-of-scope companies. The JLR attack highlighted the threat to the UK economy of gaps in the cyber resilience of organisations that hold a critical place in the UK's employment market, either directly or through employment provided by their supply chain entities. The government justified its £1.5 billion bailout in the form of a loan guarantee based on protecting 34,000 directly employed staff and 120,000 supply chain jobs. But the truth is that the government can ill afford to remain in a position where it's forced to stump up similar guarantees to other out-of-scope companies that are deemed too big to fail in the event of future attacks of this type. The risk is not receding, it's only intensifying, as we can see from the number and scale of attacks over the last year. And this is why, in many ways, this bill is so surprising in that it does not address the biggest and certainly the most publicly visible cyber attacks and incidents that we've seen, certainly in over the past year. A solution does need to be found to mitigate this challenge to the UK economy. The first task is identifying companies that have the potential to cause disruption on the scale of JLR in the event of a serious cyber attack. The Secretary of State should absolutely be reviewing this. Then is the question about the most effective response, whether that is regulation or looking at what role cybersecurity insurance can play in companies taking responsibility for the financial consequences of an attack, critically shielding the public finances from those consequences. The danger is that effectively for very large companies that are quite critical in our economy, they are de facto being insured by the government in the context of a serious cyber attack. Clearly that cannot continue. Surely this is something government has considered, and I'd be grateful for the Minister's confirmation of his department's plans for addressing this pressing risk. Moving on to new clauses 8, 11 and 12, tabled in them with Honourable Member for Brecon and Radnor, these new clauses seek to bring local authorities, in relation to their functions managing electoral rolls and social care records, the Electoral Commission and political parties within the scope of regulation as operators of essential services. I totally share the Honourable Gentleman's concerns regarding the threat to our institutions from foreign interference, which goes to the heart of our amendments, which we'll be debating later, relating to our electoral infrastructure. We know that attacks on the vital apparatus of our democracy are a focal point of malicious cyber activity by hostile state actors. The NCSC confirms that China state-affiliated actors were responsible for cyber attacks on the UK Electoral Commission and Parliament in 2021 and 2022, In November last year, MI5 issued an alert to parliamentary staff on the risk of Chinese state espionage. These institutions form the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and government must urgently look at how they can better safeguard in a world where emerging technologies are being deployed by malicious actors to undermine the democratic process. NCSC stated in their 2025 report that the next UK general election is expected to be the first to rely predominantly on cloud-based electoral management systems. To prepare for this transition, NCSC have said they are supporting the Ministry of Communities, Housing and Local Government to ensure that security standards and resilience measures are future-proofed. Can the Minister update us on this work and his assessment on what further steps are needed to safeguard the UK democracy in the face of this growing risk? Thank you.
I'd like to move that this debate be now adjourned.
The question is that the debate now be adjourned. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. No. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.